Alright, so our second video covers the period from the fall of the Roman Empire in about 500 AD to where our class picks up in about 1450. This period of time is often called the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. I prefer the term Middle Ages because the Dark Ages has a negative connotation that I don't necessarily believe entirely applies to the period. And so, again, the fall of the Roman Empire was precipitated by Germanic invasions, particularly from north of the Danube River. As these Germanic tribes invaded what was then the western half of the Roman Empire, they found viable farmland and they began to settle in distinct clusters. This map shows you where some of those groups began to settle, the most famous of which was probably the Franks, which later ends up becoming obviously the Kingdom of France. Remember that the eastern half of the Roman Empire continues, which is this yellowish beigeish section on the map. From here on out, it'll be called the Byzantine Empire, which is the first name that was initially given to Constantinople, the capital. Now, one of the reasons why this time period is known as the Dark Ages is because of the massive amounts of violence that occurred during this time period. One of the reasons for that violence is multiple series of invasions, particularly in the early Middle Ages, from various different groups, whether it be the Vikings raiding and pillaging from Scandinavia and coming down through the coastlines into modern-day England and France, or whether it be the Muslim Empire, which was expanding through North Africa and had invaded Spain and was moving up towards and through France, or whether it be the Magyars who were coming from Central or Eastern Europe into various different places and raiding. And all of these invasions led to a unique political system which was known as feudalism. So the best way to teach you what feudalism is to give you a fictitious example. So let's say that I, King Bailey, am ruler of this fictitious land depicted here on the map. I know that I'm not able to provide protection to all of my citizens in my kingdom due to limitations in transportation and communication and military technology. So what I do instead is I break up my kingdom into little tiny pieces. So obviously I keep a little part here for myself, and this becomes the royal estates here. And so that's my land. And then I decide to my most loyal subjects and the people who helped me conquer this, that I give a little piece here to one of my loyal subjects here, and this becomes their land. And then here I break this up into two different spots, and I give a little piece to somebody else here, and I give a little piece to somebody here, and this gets broken up, and this gets broken up, and these get broken up as well. And so what ends up happening is that I split my kingdom to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different parts. Now, I don't give each one of these 6 different pieces of land away for nothing. As I give this land to my vassals or person who received the land, in return, I expect them to provide me with military service if I need it for various different wars or conflicts I may be involved in. And they also promise to pay me taxes in various different manners. Now, the second problem is even these smaller sections are probably too large for any one lord to be able to manage effectively and provide protection for their people. And so what ends up happening on top of the initial division of the kingdom is that each of these lords then subdivides their kingdom into even smaller portions and gives their land to additional people. Now, these additional lords, again, just like they had promised to provide military service and taxes to the person giving them the land. What this does is it further fragments the kingdom into even smaller, tinier little pieces. Now, in feudalism, what would happen then, even again, is that each one of those pieces would then be subdivided into even smaller pieces. But for the sake of time, I don't want to draw even more lines on this map. And so what we end up having is a kingdom that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28 different places and rulers in each one of their kingdoms. And what that means is each one of these little tiny 28 different places has their own ruler who has almost full control over their entire lands, which means that each of these areas has their own army, probably their own castle or some sort of fortification, and their own set of laws and courts. True power is held at the local level at each one of these tiny little places. The king only has power in the fact that he commands the loyalty of the people he initially gave the land to. And those people then command the loyalty of the people that they gave their land to. But the king really, honestly, has no power other than in his own estates here. Here, the most important person is the local lord, who sets military policy and who sets local laws and creates courts and stimulates economic activity. And so this political system creates a hierarchical social and political system throughout the country, where the king is at top and various different nobles are somewhere below him, the highest nobles being people like barons and dukes, and then below them, the smallest and lowest level of the nobility would be the common knight, who sometimes would have a large piece of land and sometimes would simply live in that castle with the nobility. And then at the very bottom would be everybody else here represented by peasants, but this would include anybody who lives in towns and any other place in society. Now, the only way in which you could be a noble is if your father was a noble, and so this is a very rigid hierarchical structure. This system of feudalism also leads us to the economic system of the time, which can be called manorialism. Each one of these lowest levels of the feudal pyramid would, at its very basic, contain at least one what is called manor. And a manor is simply the economic unit of the time. What a manor most likely would include is the manor house, which is usually where the lord or the nobility would have lived. On a large manor, this would have been in a castle or some sort of other large fortification. At some of the lowest levels of the manor, this is just simply a nice house. It would also include the necessary tools for society at that point in time: blacksmiths, a bakery, a mill as well. It would include all of the planting areas around the house and various different other social functions, such as the church or the priest's house. The head of the manor would obviously be the noble whose land this is, who was given to him by the king or some other noble who he provided his loyalty to. But along with the land that the noble had received, he would also be granted the people who were living on this land, who were known as serfs. Serfs were legally tied to the land. They had given up a tremendous amount of their freedom at some point in time in order to be allowed to farm various different parts of this land on the Lord's behalf. And for this privilege of being allowed to use some of the Lord's land, they had given up, one, their freedom of movement. If they wanted to move off the manor, they would have to ask the Lord's permission, which was seldom granted. They also gave up their freedom of marriage, which they also had to ask the Lord. They gave up various different work-related fees. They would have to work for the Lord a certain number of days a year. They'd have to give up a percentage of their crops, and various different other fees and taxes to the Lord. Now, serfs were not slaves, because serfs couldn't be bought and sold like slaves could, but serfs were tied to the piece of land in which the Lord had received probably several generations ago. Because agricultural work tended to be rather difficult and all time consuming, especially during the planting and harvest season, the typical division of labor where we have men out working in the field and women at home taking care of the children really didn't exist for the common person during the Middle Ages. There was a pretty even division of labor. And while there may be things considered men's work, which might be the planting and the weeding of the field, women also engaged in work outside of the house that was necessary for the household to function, whether it be going and having the grain milled or gathering food or taking care of the livestock. And so this really challenges our traditional gender roles that we think existed for all of time. And while men were legally entitled to more and in often places had more legal rights to own property and such, socially women were fairly well accepted during the Middle Ages. And this holds true for the nobility or the upper class as well, as many upper class nobles went off to fight in various different wars and conflicts. Oftentimes the woman was left at home running the household and doing all the things that were typical male dominated professions and work at that point in time. And in many places, because of this, women were allowed to inherit their husband's estate if he died in battle or through various other means as well. The one unifying factor throughout most of Western Europe at this point in time was the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church obviously spread during the Roman Empire and continued to be an important factor in most of the Germanic kingdoms. At this point in time, through most of the Middle Ages, the most important leader in all of Europe, and in obviously the Roman Catholic Church, was the Pope, or also known as the Bishop of Rome. Much like feudalism, the Church had its own hierarchical structure, where at the top of the feudal pyramid was the emperor or the king. At the top of the Church's pyramid was obviously the Pope. Various different groups existed below the Pope, cardinals, archbishops, and bishops, which were appointed by the Pope, were the next level, and then underneath them were the people that most people interacted with, the priests and various different groups of monks, and at the very bottom were the believers or the most other people throughout society. This also very elegantly matches up with the feudal system, as there was a lot of overlap between various different classes. And so, while there was very seldom overlap between the Pope and various different kings, oftentimes the nobility would also be the religious nobility. Various different princes, dukes, and earls would also end up being various different cardinals and bishops, which will cause some problems that we'll see when we study chapter 14. Also, nobility would oftentimes send lesser children, the second or third born child, off to school to be priests or monks. And then at the very bottom, all of the believers and serfs were very similar. The Catholic Church during this time period became the center of knowledge and of learning. The place most associated with this in the Catholic Church are the various different monasteries that grew up in many different places throughout Western Europe. Because the church became the center of learning, it also became the authority in all knowledge, basically whatsoever. And while they didn't reject the classics or the Greco-Roman ideas of science and technology and the Aristotelian view of the world, what great thinkers during the time period like St. Thomas Aquinas did was try to reinterpret the Catholics through their Christian faith. And if things could not be explained through their Christian faith and the Bible, they were oftentimes discarded. Also, learning obviously was very selective, and the number of people who were educated was very, very low. Books had to be copied by hand in the monasteries, which meant that the price of books was very, very, very high, and very few people were able to afford them. So very few people during this time period ended up becoming literate unless they were a member of the clergy or the clergy nobility, or a monk, or a fairly high level of priests. Even many local parish priests were illiterate and couldn't read and write. The importance of the Catholic Church can be seen in the art and architecture of the time. By far and away, the most famous buildings of in any town and of the time period were the Gothic cathedrals that were built in the 1100s to about the 1300s. Any major town, whether it be London, Paris, or Reims, would have had their own Gothic cathedral. And obviously, by far and away, the most famous of these cathedrals is Notre Dame in Paris, which can be seen in the three pictures clustered over here on your left-hand side. The purpose of these buildings was to glorify God, not necessarily the individual that we had seen in the Greco-Roman times, but these buildings were designed to glorify God and built for that purpose. As you can see, the tall structures with their spires are designed to draw your view upwards. You can also see the art and architecture depicting religious themes, and one of the most widespread artistic genres was woven tapestries, which were right here, and illuminated manuscripts. Again, both of these things were designed with religious themes and were designed primarily for the glorification of the church and of God. The church also had a tremendous amount of political power during the Middle Ages. The term Christendom refers to this idea that the Western Europe, particularly these parts in blue here, or purple here, that represent the Catholic Church, would one day be united into a single kingdom with the Pope as its head. And this isn't as ridiculous as it sounds, as most of these places operated under church law, or what is known as canon law. A lot of the social functions of society, marriage, birth, and divorce, were handled under the church's jurisdiction, while the feudal lord would be able to handle things like robbery and murder and protection of property. It was the church's role to oversee the social institutions of the time. And so the popes during this time are arguably the single most important political figures, more important than any of the kings or any of the feudal lords during this time period. And I think this idea of the pope as the political leader is best manifested in the Crusades, starting in about 1100 AD, where the Pope was able to convince most of Western Europe, thousands of different soldiers, including various different kings and nobles, to leave their country and attempt to reconquer the Holy Land, the Middle East, Jerusalem, from the Muslim invaders who had taken it over several hundred years before. The Crusades lasted for about 100 years, and various different sources say there's anywhere between 4 and 12 different crusades that occurred. But it illustrates the power of the church to even declare war and send various different groups throughout Europe off to war to fight in the name of the Catholic Church. And so the three most important things to know about the Middle Ages, and these are some gross generalizations, and these things changed over time and were different in different locales, but the understanding of the political system of feudalism, the social role and the political role and the power and prestige of the Catholic Church, and then the economic system of manneralism and what it meant for both the nobility and the average everyday person, are really the things that we need to understand as we move forward and start to begin our diving into European history. And so this is a map of Europe in 1400, about 50 years before our class, quote unquote, starts. And as you can see, a lot of these feudal states still existed in various different places, particularly in what we're going to learn is known as the Holy Roman Empire, where modern day Germany would exist. But you also start to see that while feudalism still existed in France and England, the kings were beginning to consolidate their power, and we're going to take an even closer look at that in chapter 13 when we start to delve into what we call the new monarchies. But this is where we're going to leave off.